warm welcome to another Sharing Your Passion. My guest today is Jane Duncan Rogers. Jane is a remarkable lady. She's a psychology graduate. She was the youngest ever HR director at a famous Oxford Street departmental store. She became a coach. She is an author. She ran her own alternative health business. She has lived for many years in the Findhorn community, and she is, let's say, someone with some wonderful experiences, vast knowledge of the area around spirituality, and also, in particular, grief. Now, around 4 years ago, Jane's husband Philip sadly died after a long illness, and Jane, it is fair I think to say, suffered a certain amount of pain and discomfort, both during the period of his illness and in the aftermath thereof, as she came to cope with the grief and the various consequences of losing someone so beloved and precious to her, as one would expect. But that was not all. Jane discovered and came to know many gifts from this passage of time, from her husband's death, from the grieving process, and from the whole experience of seeing things differently, becoming different in her attitude and perspective on what death really meant, especially for her. And she came to realize a number of gifts that became for her part of the treasure of actually what happened. Many silver linings, which we will now soon hear about. 2 months ago, Jane published a book called Gifted by Grief, which is an account of her experiences, both the time with her, through her husband's illness and then through the grieving process, and ultimately a wonderful section on all the gifts that she discovered as a result of going through this process. Jane, thank you very much for joining me today. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And it must have been really, let's say, difficult in a conventional sense. First of all, to learn that your husband had this illness, and then to, if you like, cope with it in a way that would be, if you like, mutually appropriate for each other in view of your love and your desire for each other. How was that?
Yes, it was really hard. I mean, you don't expect these things to happen to you, that out of the blue you get your partner or whoever gets a diagnosis of a life-threatening illness. It's one of those things that you don't think is ever going to happen to you. You probably never even think about it. And then it does. So what do you do? Well, what we did was we met it in the best way that we possibly could, which for my husband was to accept the fact that it was here and to try to discover the message that it had in the hope that it would then leave. And he started a blog that year, which the focus of which was very much that. And I was completely supportive of him in doing that because he was a good writer, but he hadn't been doing it for quite a long time. And I could see that this was part of the healing for him, was to be able to write about it. At that time, we didn't know. You don't know, when somebody's diagnosed with something, you just don't know what's going to happen. We were told that if he had stomach cancer, and we were told that if he had chemo and then an operation and then some more chemo, and they managed to get all the cancer out in the operation, that actually he had a really good prognosis, 20 years or more perhaps. He was 66 when he died. So initially we were very hopeful. It became living with cancer, like people talk about, as opposed to trying the possibility of death. That came later because the operation didn't work in terms of getting all the cancer out. And at that point we were then dealing with another type of journey, which was still about not knowing actually, because when you're alive until you're not, and when you're alive, you carry on doing what you do when you're alive. up to the point that you're not here anymore. Which I know that sounds terribly sort of simple and trite, and the world does narrow down as your body begins to, what does it do? Well, it begins to die. It begins to die off, basically. And so, of course, your world narrows down. But, you know, what could have been a really horrendous experience turned out for us to be 14 months of, for the most part, incredible intimacy and amazing love. And even to the point where we were able to say one morning over breakfast in our lovely sunroom that actually we were grateful for the cancer, which is quite something to say. And we were grateful for it because it had brought gifts with it, as well as it was going to split us apart. But in that moment, we were feeling very much the presence of love alongside the cancer. So,
was that the greatest gift, the love? Did it bring your love? Did it must have been challenging as well, but did it actually enhance your love?
Definitely. It's undoubtedly in that last year that we had together, that was the biggest gift that we had. And it was more than just us loving each other. It developed into a point where we felt that we couldn't say, I love you, because it meant there was an I here, a separate person, and a separate person over there being a you, and it didn't feel like that. We had read a little bit about this sort of stuff, but it didn't feel like that. That began to feel like a statement of separation, and we had never felt so together, and so much just kind of, it wasn't that we were one person, it was more that we were just basking in the presence of love, and that really was amazing. It really was amazing.
How did you first come together?
I was about 34 at the time, and I had announced to the world that I thought it was time for me to have a proper relationship, having not been very good at sustaining them past 3 months at this point. And I, in a therapy session one day, I announced to my therapist that I thought I was ready for a relationship. But the problem was there were no decent men out there, which she refuted, of course. And actually, then one of her friends who was staying with her was driving to the office where I was working that day, and he gave me a lift, and that turned out to be Philip. So it was quite a quick meeting after I made a decision that I was ready. Suddenly somebody popped up.
A nice synchronicity.
Very much so, yeah.
Let's hear a little bit about your background, Jane. You were, I think, one of the first teachers of Louise Hay's You Can Heal Your Life here in the UK.
Yes.
And you trained with Louise for a while. So that presumably had quite a formative, or did it have a sort of a formative experience? Was it a formative part of your, your philosophy and your perspective on life? How did that?
Yes,
How did that impact on you?
I had been given the book You Can Heal Your Life and it had sat on my bookshelf for about 2 years, and I'd done nothing with it. But by this time I had given up my corporate career. I was in my early 30s. I was working on the Greek island of Skiros, and I met a couple of guys who were going out to train with her that year. Now, Louise herself was still doing the trainings at this time, and I was so inspired by them, I applied as well for the following year, and I got a place on the course by a series of synchronous events again. It was absolutely wonderful, and I came back to the UK in the position of being the only woman at that time who had been trained by Louise Hay. And I knew I wasn't ready to run the groups, even though I'd been trained. I needed to get some more individual work myself, and more individual therapy, which I did. But then in 1992, I set up the first little group, just like Louise had done in her front room. I did the same. I think half a dozen or 8 people turned up for an evening course based on You Can Heal Your Life, and it went really well, and that's when I started. Then I started doing weekend groups around the UK and Europe as well, and for the next best part of 10 years probably that's what I was doing. So yeah, it was pretty instrumental, that book, in my life.
Fantastic. For those who may not know Louise Hay or may not know much about her, can you just tell us a little bit about the sort of the basis of her teachings?
Louise Hay had been diagnosed with cancer. This is many years ago now. She must be in her late 80s now, I think. And she's the founder of Hay House Publishing, which is quite a well-known publishing house. She wrote a book called You Can Heal Your Life after she had cured herself from cancer by a variety of different methods. Not least what the content of that book was about, which is very much about how the way you think contributes to the state of your health, mental, physical, emotional health.
Right.
She's really considered a grandmother of the self-help and mind-body-spirit movement. And certainly the queen of affirmations, affirmations being a statement that you say as if it were true, whether it be negative or positive. She's known, of course, for the positive ones, because generally speaking, you feel better when you say the positive ones than the negative ones. And that's what I was trained in, to help people begin to address their thinking, to notice it, to notice what they were thinking, to turn it around, and therefore to turn their lives around in that way.
In the book, you also talk about a wonderful experience when you were a student in South Wales, I believe.
Yeah.
I won't steal your thunder, so why don't you tell us a little bit about that? Because that struck me as potentially maybe a sort of turning moment or a transformational moment in your life.
Oh, definitely. I was 16 at the time, and I was a student at Atlantic College in South Wales, and walking along the cliff tops, looking out to sea with a friend of mine. Now, what I remember was that he was saying to me, all you've got to do is be honest with yourself. And I was going, well, how do you do that? How do you be honest with yourself? I could see something in his eyes. I didn't know what it was, but I recognized something, and I wanted it. So there I was, we were walking along, I was being frustrated, and suddenly I dropped to the ground, literally onto my knees, onto my back, rolling around in the grass, laughing. Now what had happened was it was as if a bolt of lightning had struck me. It really felt like that. It felt as though I was awash in light, love. I didn't know what to call it. I had absolutely no context for this, but it felt like I knew what the point of being alive was about. And all I wanted to do was to reach out to the whole world and hug everyone and let them know as well. And it was so strong that I kind of knew that if I jumped off the edge of the cliff, I would soar upwards. Well, I didn't do that, of course, because there was another part of me that knew that the body actually would sink down. Although at that time I wasn't making a distinction between the body and anything else, but it was very, very powerful, and really it set me on the road to being a spiritual seeker, because after that, because of course it kind of, the experience petered out. Nobody understood what I was talking about when I tried to tell them, least of all my dear mum, who when I rang her up to share this amazing thing that had happened, kind of changed the subject, I seem to remember. Yes, dear, very nice. And, but anyway, that I then began seeking for that experience over and over again for many years, many, many years.
So was that the genesis, if you like, of your following a spiritual path, and how did it evolve after that?
Well, it's what started me in learning meditation at university, because I thought that would be a way to get it. It wasn't. And then I started being interested in the whole healing and the psychotherapeutic movement, the personal growth. I think by this time I'd worked out that yes, I was something to do with my life, Probably I was the one that was responsible for it. So that led me into all sorts of books, you know, ones that you will have read and some of the people listening will have read as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was very important, that moment in my life.
Were there any other pivotal moments, do you think, that might be worth mentioning from which there were learnings, especially learnings of gifts, before your husband was diagnosed?
Let me think about that. My mind has gone blank.
That's good. It happens.
There must be. Well, you know, my attitude to life has always been one of, okay, this has happened, let's find out where the gifts are, let's make the most of it. It's maybe not what I wanted to have happened, but I've never been one for staying attached to what I wanted, but rather to what's that saying, you're making lemonade out of lemons, that one, yeah. But right now I can't think of anything.
If you have lemons, make lemonade.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
But don't think anything really bad had ever really happened to me. Not in terms of major events. You know, nobody that I knew had been seriously ill or died. So, yeah, of course I'd had ups and downs in life. Everybody has those.
Were there any significant losses at all?
You'd think there would be, wouldn't you? But
maybe, well, maybe not.
Obviously not that have impacted me in such a way that I could remember. So it felt like when Philip died, it felt like it came out of the blue. You know, it was a bit like, hang on a minute, these sorts of things don't happen to people like me. You know, I've been good. I've been a spiritual seeker. I've explored myself, and I understand X, Y, Z. It's not fair. There was definitely some of that, definitely, which is, you know, complete rubbish. It's, you know, if an illness like that happens, it happens, and it can happen to anyone. It's got nothing at all to do with how good you were or how you like to trip myself up there. It may very well have something to do with how you think, and that's one possible contributing component of that.
After the diagnosis and through the time of your husband's illness, maybe you didn't get a sense of it at the time, but do you feel now that there were times when you were able to sort of open your heart, as it were, to the illness, and times when the mind might have been taking over and saying, you know, we must do this, we must do that, and blah, blah, blah? Was there this sort of conflict, in a sense, between, let's say, conventional and not so conventional thinking, and how did you, how did that evolve?
That's a good question. For me, I was following Philip's lead in a way, and he had decided that he needed to go the conventional medical route as well as having mistletoe.
So you would have gone the non-conventional route, would you?
Not necessarily. I would hesitate to say that, because I don't think you can ever really know until it happens.
Okay.
However, I did know that my beliefs in that way of thinking would have been stronger than his. And it's possible that I might have chosen to not have medical intervention, to not have chemo or an operation. Okay. But I don't know. The truth is, I really don't know. But he also knew that his belief system was not as strong in that way as mine was, and that therefore he was going to have conventional treatment as well as, alongside that, the alternative treatment. So he had the mistletoe treatment, he had various other types of complementary therapies as well.
Sorry to interrupt you, Jane, but in case people wondering what's the mistletoe treatment, can you just give us a little bit of...
No, that's fine. Mistletoe has been used to treat cancer for the best part of 100 years in Germany, actually.
Wow.
It's part of the anthroposophical medicine system that is associated with the Rudolf Steiner schools. It's relatively controversial in the rest of the world.
Does it work?
It certainly works for some people. I have to say, no, it didn't work for Philip.
Okay.
But actually, we don't really know that.
Mm.
How do we know that he didn't live for longer? He himself was convinced that it helped him feel better alongside getting the chemo, which is a pretty difficult drug to take anyway.
Mm-hmm.
The effects of it can be very difficult. And mistletoe taken alongside chemo is supposed to help the body cope with chemo.
Okay.
It is more successful when you can inject it directly into tumours, and because of the nature of his particular cancer, that couldn't be done. So whether or not that had something to do with it, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But they've certainly had lots of good results with varying other types of cancer. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's the mistletoe. But to get back to your question about, I've forgotten what your question was.
How you resolved or reconciled, in a sense, the conventional and the
yeah.
non-conventional. I mean, for example, based on, obviously, you'd spent a lot of time with Louise Hay. She has, I think it's fair to say, certain ideas and certain beliefs around illness generally, not just cancer. And that's just one example. But how much your sort of spiritual education, as it were, was impacting, and how much was let's keep on the conventional route.
Well, we were trying to hold both at the same time, and from my memory, Philip was pretty good about being positive about the whole situation. That included him being tearful, very tearful sometimes, and being angry sometimes as well. But neither of those things are things that are not positive unless you've allocated them as being negative emotions, which I don't think is very helpful.
Right.
And I was able to support him in that. So I think we did a pretty good job of being able to hold both things together. It's difficult in our society to go down only the alternative route. There's a lot of pressure to not do that. But anyway, that was not an option for him because it's not what he wanted to do. And I wanted to support him. So I supported him in that, but I also supported him in the other ways as well.
So did that bring, in a sense, a little bit of an inner conflict within you, or was it, well, this is as it is, Philip is going his own way and I support that unconditionally? I know maybe that's not such an easy question.
No, that's okay. Because he had been on, I think he had lost his way from a spiritual point of view beforehand.
Okay.
In my opinion, did he agree with me about this? Yes, he agreed with me that he agreed with me that a lot of what I had kept on bagging on about him to him before he was diagnosed was right. I could have been really pleased about that, but actually that was irrelevant at that point. We had been having a bit of a difficult time in our relationship because he had so much lost his way and he was not willing or able to find it in the way that I was able to engage with him. And so there was some frustration there. But when he was diagnosed, he just turned 180 degrees and started facing everything that had been coming to him. And I really respected him for that. And that opened my heart again to him as well. And I saw a man who very courageously was dealing with difficult, particular type of cancer, which is not easy. None of them are easy, of course. And dealing with it at all the different levels: emotional, spiritual, physical, psychological, in the best way that he possibly could. And all I wanted to do was support him, in that, which I did, both practically and emotionally. Yeah.
Some spiritual teachers say that, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but some spiritual teachers say that all illness is caused in the emotional body, or starts in the emotional body. Some others say that it starts in the mind. I think, of course, in Miracles says something similar. were you aware of that, and was this something that you were able to, or was it appropriate in a sense to investigate this for your and Philip's benefit?
Yeah, now this had been a point of contention between us because we didn't agree on this beforehand. And actually we had been going to a Course in Miracles meeting. I had been going for a couple of years anyway, a local one here, and he joined me for a while. But I do remember we got to the lesson about illness and neither of us could take it. We could not take it. It was too close to the bone. It felt too black and white. And regardless of whether that is true or not, whether your emotions or your thoughts cause the illness, in the moment when you have the illness, that's arisen because of your past thoughts and feelings. So what can you do about them? You can't do anything about them in the past. You can do something about them right now, and that's what he was doing, and that was really important. I think in a way it's when you're diagnosed, it's irrelevant whether that is true or not, so long as you're attending to it at all levels in the moment. Personally, I believe that everything contributes to it. There will be something on every level, which is why it's important to deal with it at every level. So, you know, what you're eating, how you're conducting your life, the quality of stress that you have or haven't got, the quality of your thoughts, how you express your feelings or don't express your feelings, you know, where are you on your spiritual path? I think all of those are equally as important.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the grieving you experience, if that's okay with you, Jane.
Sure.
I mean, the book contains some, what were for me, some really emotive and moving sections and descriptions of what you were experiencing. It's hard not to forget your expression "tsunami of tears," which was very powerful when I read that. Obviously, I don't want you to go back into that place, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about the challenges of the grieving process and how, if you like, they developed into this, if there was a sequence, into this realization of the gifts of what you were experiencing.
Well, you know, I called my book Gifted by Grief, but, you know, after he first died, if anybody had shown me a book like that, I would have just probably hit them. I mean, you know, it's not a gift. When somebody first dies, it's not a gift. It just feels horrible, and it was horrible. And the intensity of the emotion I knew was there because I was using my journal a lot. I was writing in my journal, I was scribbling in my journal, and only when I came to do the research for the book and went back over my journal entries did I see how painful it was, because I'd forgotten. Now actually that was quite good, because 2 years on I could see that I had moved on, because there was this emotion and it was raw and painful and on the paper, and I was no longer feeling like that, or at least nothing like as often. So that was very helpful. Was there I don't think there was a process.
Right.
You know, people talk about stages of grief and all that. I knew about the stages of grief from my my studies, but it's not a process that you go through. There may be times when you deny it, and there were definitely times when I was like, has this really happened? How could it have happened? You know, I didn't believe it. And I was having experiences like that for quite a long time. There were definitely moments of being angry. And the one thing that I did know that I knew was really important was that it was important to feel all the feelings, including feeling no feelings, if you see what I mean. And I just knew that if I didn't allow that to happen, I would actually be creating a rod for my own back, if you like, because the process would last longer.
So are you saying, in effect, that you weren't resisting the feelings? Yeah.
I wasn't resisting them. In fact, I'd say that I opened the doors wide to allow them to be there fully, which isn't an easy thing to do when they feel so horrible. But I kind of held on to this idea in a way, you know, that if they were there and they were fully felt, they would flow through and they would then leave. So I think, can't remember if I put this in the book or not, but I had an image of when a feeling comes knocking at the door of your house. The inclination, if you don't like that feeling, is to pull down the blinds and bolt the door. But actually, what is needed to happen is that you open the windows and you open the door and welcome the feeling in and open the back door at the same time so that it can come into the house, can swirl around, and it can go easily out again as well. And that image worked really well for me, and it is what happened. I didn't always feel incredibly better after whatever feeling had gone, but it would come and it would go. And that is actually what feelings do. And you might, you know, if we even take it out of this kind of dramatic context, it's like, well, you know, one morning you wake up, you feel great, and maybe the great feeling lasts for, I don't know, an hour or two or something like that, and then something happens and you feel different. Or something doesn't happen and you feel different anyway. It's a feeling coming and going. It is amazing what happens when we just allow that process. So this is really important for me, that, and I would encourage, it's probably the most important thing out of all of it in terms of all the grief stuff.
It's interesting because in the book you also say that you had moments of joy during the grieving process. Now,
that really perplexed me.
Tell us about that. You know, that it's not all negative, or it wasn't all negative in a sense.
I remember in particularly, I think it was about a week after he had died, I was at home, I was living on my own. I was out walking in the woods one day, it was a beautiful day, and I was feeling happy. And it was a kind of deep happiness. I looked around and all I could see was the blue sky, the lovely trees, the birds singing, and I felt happy inside, I could feel it. And yet I knew, in my mind's eye, I knew that I was going home to an empty house. My husband had died, my worst fear had come true, and I couldn't understand why I was feeling happy. The happiness was not anything to do with this experience that had happened. I don't think I really knew that at the time, but looking back now, I can see that was happiness coming knocking at the door. And I was allowing that as well. Now that happiness it went out the back door as well as all the other ones. And probably on balance, looking back, there was a lot more unhappy feelings knocking and coming through. But it was just as important to welcome the so-called good feelings as the bad ones. So not resisting the feelings is important. Now,
And how did you do that? Is it just a question of observing the feelings, being with the feelings, not judging or you know, commenting on them in your head, so to speak, or however that happens in your thought process?
Yeah, for me, not judging was very important. Because, you know, when you judge something, you just put a layer on it. You're saying it's either good or bad or anything in between. You're putting an extra layer on the top, and that just keeps everything down, literally, as a layer. So specifically, if I felt angry, even if I was in company, I would usually swear, sometimes quite a lot. I don't recall ever shouting at the top of my voice in the middle of a restaurant or anything like that, but I certainly burst into tears in restaurants. I just didn't care about keeping up an appearance. And often people who are grieving say they feel they have to put a brave face on. And I decided earlier on, I'm not sure exactly how conscious this was, but I decided I was not going to be I wasn't going to be pretending. it wasn't going to be healthy for me, and it wasn't actually going to be healthy for anyone else, even though pretending looks on the surface as though it is more comfortable for everybody else.
Do you think there's an element of that as well in the wider sense, in the more general sense that I mean, did you feel in any way under sort of any pressure or mental pressure in a sense to act in a certain way because you lost your husband? I mean, grieving is, we believe, isn't it, sort of part of the process, and I'm not saying that it isn't, but there is this element of, thinking it's bad, for example, that one has lost a loved one. And again, I'm not saying it's good, but that these conditioned thoughts can come in. Did those affect you, do you think, in a significant way? Or did you have such thoughts?
I don't think I had those thoughts. I do remember something floating around at the time of, it was a bit like, how could I be, this will sound very spiritually arrogant, but anyway, how could I be so developed? How could I have spent so many thousands of pounds and so many hours in doing, personal growth work and have ended up being with somebody who had died when they weren't supposed to? It was like, as if that is, it was just mad, really. It was a bit mad. But I think I recognised the madness, so I didn't take it very seriously. I could see those thoughts and I didn't give them very much attention. So from that point of view, I think I was aware of, I was going to say I was aware of what other people might be thinking. Well, I was aware of what other people might be thinking, but I didn't care.
Yes.
I decided not to care
Sure.
about what they thought, which led to some not so easy moments. But in the face of death, not very much else matters. You really get clear about what your priorities are, and me taking care of other people or being nice to save their feelings wasn't really very high up.
Right, I'm sure. Yeah. Let's talk about the gifts, because that's really ultimately, I guess, what the book is about, and what you want to share as your passion today. So, death is not, let's say this, that death sometimes gets a bad rap, to put it in a sort of fairly neutral way. But what do you, before we come on to the grieving process, I mean, do you see the gifts itself, or have you seen gifts itself from the process of death and dying, that you can share with us, that you think might be valuable to others who might find themselves in a similar situation?
Well, if you have been with somebody when they die, then, and this is what happened for me with Philip, because I was there when he died in the hospital bed, I saw very clearly what I had known intellectually, which is that we are not our bodies. And I thought that I knew that experientially. This is what I had thought previously, But here it was, evidence. There was no doubt about it. Within a matter of seconds, the person who had been there, my husband, my lover, my best friend, was no longer there. There was this bag that looked like him. It looked very similar. In fact, it looked the same, but it wasn't him. So that set me off on a quest, really, to discover what it was that had been in that empty bag lying on the hospital bed, that wasn't there any longer, but that was still here in this body and in that body and in anybody else's body that is alive. And I was kind of a bit confused about that, because this was not a new thing for me to be exploring, but I felt I was exploring it in a completely different way. And the answer, well, it's the life force, which would have been enough previously, was no longer enough. So that whole that sort of propelled me on a journey of discovery, which was quite an amazing journey. It's still quite an amazing journey. Yeah. So that's definitely one of the gifts. Maybe I'll come back to that.
So that was really, to try and paraphrase it or put it in perhaps a little more concisely, that what I'm getting from that is that you're saying that this was re-examining or re-establishing, if you like, who we are, who are we?
Yeah.
You know.
Well, you know, when you've seen it, it's like there it was, evidence before my eyes.
Your husband's death,
Yeah.
you're talking, yeah?
Yeah.
Because you were there, weren't you?
I was there,
when he died, yeah.
You know, and I'm sure people will recognise this, and some people, you know, when some people die, it's clear that their spirit, or that's how we talk about it, their spirit is still hanging around in the room. People have documented this, they can feel it.
Right.
In Philip's case, that did not happen. There was nothing there. And I wasn't the only one in the room either, you know, so it wasn't just me not able to feel it.
Yeah.
This life force it had gone. And it was gone so much that I wasn't interested in that body anymore. I didn't care about it. I mean, I had to take care of it because it had to be dealt with. And that was very helpful, I think, looking back, because I no longer identified with him as a body. I had a memory of somebody in a body, and some of those memories, sometimes I would feel pain at those memories, and then sometimes at the same memory I would feel joy. But who he was still there, has always been there, has never not been there, is still there now. And actually, even just before we sat down there, I had a sense of his energy up here somewhere. Occasionally that happens still, even now. It's 4 years on now. And I've learned to trust that. It's not in the form. It's just, I've learned to trust that when that thought comes into my mind, that's probably, there's something of that life force that that was once attached to a personality called Philip is around. And you know what? Even if it's not true, I don't care, because it's really nice. It's just nice, you know. And if that makes me feel good, why not? I think I've gone off the point there, though.
Don't worry, that's fine. I was actually going to say, interestingly, as you started talking, I saw a little light come up on the wall there.
All right, interesting.
But
yes.
who knows? If you're here, Philip, welcome.
Yes, very welcome.
Very welcome. So, yeah, that was clearly then this, because what the direction then you seem to go, if I understand the book correctly, is then you start to think, well, who are we? Who am I? Who is this I that we all talk about? And of course, this is one that's engaged so many spiritual teachers and philosophers over the world, throughout the world and over the ages. But were you able to have you come to any sort of practical conclusion in that, in terms of everyday living?
Yes, you were talking earlier about us playing a game, or being in a movie of our lives. And now
This was before we came on camera, right?
Yeah, now I can see, for example, here right now, we're playing the game of having an interview.
Yes.
And I'm playing the game of having a life as an author and a speaker and a coach. And several other games as well, probably, if I think about them. Knowing that there is a game being played takes the seriousness out of living a life, because that's not really what life is. That's a demonstration of a particular game. life itself, which is showing up in this body at the moment called Jane, labelled Jane, let's say, for want of ease of interaction, is something quite different, and is at once at ease and I was going to say peaceful, but it's not. It's let's say how to describe this. Even to say it's peaceful is to attach a little bit too much to it. Mm. So it's more like there's just this. Actually, who I am is this underlying.
Is it the stillness that people like Eckhart Tolle talks about?
Yeah, as I understand it now, because I now will read Eckhart Tolle's works in a different way. I read them and I see them in a different way. And then there's the character and the play and the games all going on the surface. So the result of that is that, one of the results of that is that I am more relaxed. I'm more relaxed. I laugh at things a whole lot more. If things don't go according to plan, it's like, well, you know, I have a question to myself usually, which is, well, who am I to say that it should have been according to this plan, you know?
Yes,
it's like, which can take you off on an exploration again as well. Right. So in that sense, whether or not this would have happened if Philip had still been alive, I will never know. However, I do know that as a result of my exploration since he died, this has unfolded. And that's what I feel very grateful for. There are other things as well, but that's a major one. Yeah.
And one of the ultimate gifts which you talk about in the book is this, I mean, you describe it as what is, but my understanding of that is that means accepting what is, right? And how easy or not so easy has that been to, you know, to embrace?
Well, do you know, it reminds me, when I was doing my Louise Hay workshops all those years ago, I used to say to people, you can't move on until you've accepted what is happening here right now. You have to be able to say, okay, here I am at A, and actually I want to be at B, you know. It's quite difficult to have a journey if you don't know where you're starting from, you know. But now, I mean, that was at a relatively practical level I was dealing with it. Now, stress comes from being here right now, but wanting to be somewhere else, or wanting to do something else, or wanting it to be different in some way. And that's really what I mean by accepting what is, which can change in the moment. Because the moment you accept one thing, then there's a next moment which you may or may not accept. If you see what I mean. It's quite difficult to talk about this sort of stuff, but but that and it ties in with the resistance or the non-resistance of feelings. Looking back at the book now, I can see that actually I was resistant about one thing, which was that Philip had died at all. I do keep coming back to that in the book. I keep talking about the shock of it. And I have since met other people whose husbands or wives have died, who have been able to accept the fact of that much quicker than I was. And looking back, I think, despite feeling all the feelings and all of that, I was bashing up against this idea that I'd had of my life, which hadn't turned out the way I thought it was going to turn out. But I'm not, you know, that's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing either. It just is the way it is. So, if I was writing the book now, I might do it in a bit different way. If he had died right now, maybe I would have met it differently. I'll never know.
Of course. You said earlier that, you know, the royal you, I guess, or you personally as well, may accept may accept what is in one moment, and then you may not accept it, or accept the next moment, whatever the next moment brings. And a thought occurred to me when you said that, and that is, do you think that that is maybe indicative of where we as individuals, maybe even as a collective, need to heal? Because where we're not able to accept, is that indicative of a pattern, that's something that's maybe not whole? And why do I resist this and not that, for example? Is there an element of that, and have you experienced that sort of thing in your journey?
Well, I think that, first of all, asking the question why is not necessarily that useful.
Okay.
Which is quite a thing to say from somebody who's been a psychotherapist and counsellor for many years and encouraging people to answer why, the why question.
Right.
But actually, it takes you down a line that's where you keep on asking why. Ultimately, you'll come back down to the big questions, which is, why am I alive, and who am I, and what is it that is alive anyway? But now I've forgotten the rest of the question. What was the other bit? Well,
it was actually whether there was, that this was an indicative of patterns that were asking to be healed. In other words, where you have resistance, you may have no resistance to this moment, but then next moment, and if there is such a thing, I can't would say something different, of course, but there is resistance. What is the differentiation for you there?
The problem comes with the judgment.
Yes.
The judgment puts a good or a bad label on it.
Right.
And then we're into probably wanting the good and not the bad, which means that we are pushing away or trying to push away the bad, which means that we're not accepting it. But even with the idea of acceptance comes a judgment. It's like, but if I accept that, then this means ... whatever it is that it means to you. And that is, it doesn't mean that. It just...
So you're saying it's not a positive acceptance in a sense, it's almost a neutrality.
Yeah, exactly.
It's because you mentioned, of course, Krishnamurti's famous saying in the book, I don't mind what happens. And in a sense, that's like, okay, whatever happens, I don't need to accept it, I don't need to reject it, I don't need to condone it, I don't need to condemn it, I don't judge it at all. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because when you're doing that, you're not engaging with whatever it is. You're not giving it any more or less attention than anything else. So it can go on its way. Let's say it's an idea or a feeling or a thought or whatever it is. If you don't engage with it, and we already do this loads of times in our lives already, we have millions of thoughts that we don't engage with, but we don't notice them because we're not engaging with them. And then there's others that we do engage with, or ideas or movements or whatever it is, and we give a lot of energy to. And the ones that we like, we say are good, and the ones that we don't like, we say are bad. And all of that is liable to not accepting in the moment what is happening. And even saying that, it's like for example, this morning in meditation, I noticed this. There's still what would I call it? A wanting to separate the meditation into being a good meditation if I'm feeling peaceful, or a bad meditation if there's lots of thoughts. Okay, that's an idea that is, I've grown up with, but it's not true. In the moment, the what is, if you like, in the moment, is one moment, lots of thoughts going on. Who said that was good or bad? Actually, nobody. And if there is no labelling of it like that, then the next moment there may be hardly any thoughts. And then the next moment there might be thoughts again. It was, yeah.
And this is really about letting go and surrender, isn't it? This is what ultimately you're saying.
Yeah.
Because I think certainly for me, one of the biggest challenges of having been or being on the spiritual path, quote unquote, is actually, being able to bypass the mind is probably the wrong expression, but to actually, to be aligned with who I am, my truth, and not be thrown off balance or pushed in a certain direction by thoughts, judgments or emotions that might take me into that thought process of, well, actually this is more important than me being still and happy and content, because ultimately that may be the effect.
Yes, I've just got lost there in what the question was.
Well, there wasn't really a question, it was more my statement.
Sorry.
So you didn't miss anything. But I suppose the question is this, I mean, from your experience, how much, and I think everyone to some extent is unique, but how much is the mental conditioning, if I can call it that, and you talk a little bit about this in the book, the sort of what we're taught, education and so on, kicks in and says to us, well, actually, you must be angry at this, or you must be this and that. In other words, it's almost like Pavlov's dog. You respond to a situation in a way that you've been taught to respond to, even though you could actually, ultimately, in the spiritual sense, accept it and be with it and allow it.
I think then, the degree to which you're able to be honest with yourself,
right,
and to observe what's really going on, and the willingness that you have to tell the truth to yourself is really important. And people often have told me throughout my life how much they have admired my honesty. For me, that's like, yeah, but okay, it's like that's just the way that I am. Before I met Philip, I knew, I was saying, I'm only ever attracted to men who are unavailable in one way or another. They were either married, or they wanted to go travelling, or they were involved with somebody else, or they didn't want a committed relationship. And it took quite a while for me to realise that actually it was me that was afraid of commitment. I was saying that I wanted to be in a committed relationship, but that's not what was showing up in my life. And so I really had to look at it, stand back and look. And that's what I mean about being really honest. As a result of recognising that and admitting to myself that what I wanted, the kind of freedom that I wanted, was the kind of freedom that came through a commitment. And then I acted on it. At that point, I was working on the Greek island. I realised that was not the best place to meet men, so I didn't go out again the following year to the island to work. I stayed in London, which is a very difficult decision to make, because it's much nicer being on a Greek island. But as a result of that, and the other things that followed on, that's how I ended up meeting Philip. So I could have been honest enough with myself to admit that, but then not follow through on the actions. So that's really what I'm saying. And that actually links in with what you said to me earlier when we were talking about Eileen Caddy saying, it's all very well to listen to the little small voice within, but you need to act on it as well. That's really important. I'm quite sure, and I know that I've done this as well, listened to the small voice and not paid any attention to it. Heard it really clearly, and then taken another action. Usually doesn't work. Very wise piece of information there.
Jane, one thing I wanted to ask you is that we have, in the last few days, heard about what I think many people would call a sad and tragic event in Paris. And a number of families, a number of people who were killed in that incident would have been, their loved ones, their families would of course be potentially in this moment going through perhaps not a dissimilar situation to your own, a grieving process.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you can say to them or people like them based on your experience that you think would be helpful?
Well, the thing that comes to mind immediately is to be kind to yourself. That's really important, and that shows up in all sorts of different ways. So not just feeling the feelings, but grief hits in different ways, and it hits different people in different ways and for different lengths of time. There can be all sorts of emotions, as we've discussed, and so to allow those. What I did write a blog about just recently, in fact yesterday or the day before I think, was not to look for the gift too soon. you know, it doesn't, for those people whose loved ones have died, it's tragic. It's tragic, especially when there are younger people.
Mm.
It's easier for the mind to come to terms with death when somebody has lived a long life. But when it's been cut off early, that is particularly difficult. There may be gifts, even for all those people, there may be gifts, but they may not be discovered until quite a wee way down the line. And for some people, they may be discovered earlier. And what has to be honoured, I think, is you and your process and the way that you process the grief. It's really important that, because, you know, in our society we're not familiar with death in the way that we used to be. So it's almost abnormal. It's almost like it doesn't happen to us. But as we see with the Paris attacks and all the other things that have gone around the world, it can happen at any time in all sorts of forms.
Yeah.
And so the more we can become familiar, if you like, with the language of grief, with the language of death and dying, with the fact that actually we are all going to die at some point, that we can take care of that in terms of how comfortable we feel with that idea, and we can talk about it to people with ease, with grace, with humour even. Humour's a great one. I think that's really important, and that is part of my passion, as you referred to earlier, to enable people to become more comfortable around grieving people, which means becoming more comfortable around death.
Is that a case of being more loving and compassionate, or is there something more to that? I mean,
there's more to it, because people naturally are loving and compassionate to somebody who they know has lost someone. It's a natural human response. But if we feel awkward about it, if we don't know them very well, then it's easy for the behaviour to be awkward. Or for people, it's not unusual, unfortunately, for people to avoid people who have been bereaved, because they don't know what to say.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's better to just say, I don't know what to say. It's better to do that. Pluck up your courage and do that than say nothing at all, or to avoid the person. Because the truth is, you don't know what to say. What can you say to somebody who has lost a loved one in any circumstances, regardless of whether they're tragic? It's awful. It's just awful.
But do you think that part of that is because what we are, in a sense, taught to say isn't quite the right fit? Did you see what I'm getting with this?
Yeah.
I mean, I've had this myself. I usually say to people, you know, a good friend of mine in America died, her mother died recently, and she put a thing on Facebook, and I said, well, sending you love, you know, and that's what I felt. But to me, to say, well, my heartfelt condolences, or I'm really sorry for your loss, didn't somehow feel right. It used to, but now it doesn't.
Yeah, so there's another opportunity for you to be honest with yourself, and have the courage to act on that honesty, which is to say what is really there for you, which for you in that instance was sending you love. It's perfect. I mean, you know, that person is on the receiving end of the love that you're sending. And it's just beautiful.
Wonderful. Excellent, Jane. Just one final question about the gifts, because I think it's very important that you share with us the message that, you know, death and grieving doesn't have to be, you know, such a dark cloud, if you like, and that there are silver linings. You obviously state what you found in the book, your 3 big ones, as it were. But what would you like to sort of share with people listening and watching now, in terms of where they can not just look for the gifts, but what they might actually expect to receive as the gifts from all of this?
Well,
is it a case of looking, or is it a case of just being open to what comes?
It's both, I'd say. Definitely have to be open. You definitely have to be open to that. And that can be a bit of a challenge to start with. And there'll be a time when that is possible. There'll be an opening when that is possible.
Mm.
Because gifts can show up in all sorts of different forms. So although I talked about 3 big ones in the book for me, actually discovering that I wanted to sing and perform was another huge gift.
Wow.
Discovering that I wanted to learn Latin and ballroom dancing, I've never done any of these things before, was another huge gift. And a level of confidence that I hadn't had before, that I only recognised over a period of time. That's another huge gift as well.
Beautiful.
So that they come also with, if you're looking for them, you're going to be, that's more about an attitude shift, usually, I would say. Is that true? Maybe not usually, but it can be an attitude shift. Because sometimes it's just looking at the same thing in a different way that will be the gift itself. And also listening and acting on your intuition. I've come back to that again, but I think that's really important. Because our intuition, it also doesn't have a great rap, and partly because it comes usually in whispers. It might come in an actual whisper, but it's a quiet energy. That's why silent sitting in meditation was one of the gifts, even though I had been meditating before. That quality of wisdom that comes through in those quiet moments, that can be enough to change your life forever, or to send you in a different direction if you have the courage to follow it.
Beautiful. Jane, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure and wonderful to hear your experience. And thank you very much for listening. I do urge you to read Jane's book. When I read it, I thought this was really very powerful. And for someone having gone through the experiences that Jane has obviously gone through, very courageous and very uplifting too. And I don't think there's more for me to say, so get the book if you get a chance and read it. But Jane, do you want to say something?
Did we say the name?
Oh, Gifted by Grief, sorry, Gifted by Grief. I hope we did say that earlier, in case we didn't. That's the name of the book. And it's a wonderful read. And I tend to judge most books by the number of times I put it down and think I'll go back to that later. But I have to say it was not easy to put your book down, Jane, and so that's always a good sign. Anyway, thanks very much for watching and for listening. Jane and myself here on Sharing Your Passion, thank you very much. And I'll see you next time. Thank you. And thanks again, Jane.
Thank you.